Hi everyone. We're going to talk a little bit today about magical realism. The story that we're reading this week, The Night Face Up by Julio Cortázar, deals in this genre of magical realism. And even though you're probably more familiar than you think with this genre, I do want to just go over it, its main components, so that we're all feeling good about it when we read The Night Face Up. So first of all, what is magical realism? Magical realism is a genre of literature, and we also see it in television or film, in which fantastical elements are placed within realistic storylines. This term was originally used to describe the style of writing which became prominent in Latin America, and well-known authors are Isabel Allende, who wrote The House of the Spirits, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and our author for this week, Julio Cortázar. So what are the elements of magical realism? In magical realism, we tend to see a transformation of the everyday, normal life into something fantastical or dreamlike. In magical realism, both the dream or the fantasy world and the everyday world are given equal weight and probability in the story. And it's important to remember, though, that in magical realism, the story frame is realistic. So a lot of people, when we talk about magical realism, they hear the magical part and they don't hear the realism part. And the realism part is a key component of magical realism because it's what differentiates it from fantasy. So in magical realism, for example, a story that I read by Isabel Allende, it was called Daughter of Fortune. And in that story, one of the characters starts talking to a ghost and getting advice from a ghost. So the ghost just appears, the character starts talking to the ghost, he gets advice from the ghost goes away, and the person continues on with his life. Everything else in the story is completely realistic. It takes place in Chile, and then in San Francisco. It's during the gold rush, which is in the 1849. There's a lot of historically significant aspects to the novel that are very realistic. Nothing else about the novel would be considered fantasy, except for these few scenes that are kind of parsed throughout the book, in which this one character speaks to a ghost and gets advice from a ghost. So one of the main questions that people have when they're talking about magical realism is, what is the difference between magical realism and fantasy? So I do just want to go over that very quickly. So in fantasy novels or television shows, the setting is going to be in a completely unknown or made up world. So for example, if you've ever seen or read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the main setting is Narnia, which is a completely made up fantasy world. Now, like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, sometimes in fantasy novels, the characters will travel from the real world into the unknown fantasy world. But there is a clear distinction and separation between the two worlds. So even though in that story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the characters start off in England during World War II, and that's very realistic. When they travel into Narnia, and they stay in Narnia, they're completely encompassed in Narnia, that's when we realize it's become a fantasy. Same with like The Wizard of Oz. If you've ever seen The Wizard of Oz, it's an old movie, I know, but it's a popular movie. It's often referenced in a lot of popular culture today. Dorothy, the main character, starts off in Kansas and then travels to Oz, which is a completely fantasy world, completely made up. So that's where we see this kind of separation of the two worlds, and that would make it fantasy. Often in fantasy novels, there are elements of magic incorporated into the plot, and characters can be a range of things. They might be animals that can talk, or wizards, or fairies, or other mythical creatures. In a magical realism, the setting is going to be in the real world, the world that you and I live in, just the normal, everyday, real world. Dream or fantasy elements will be woven into this realistic setting. So a popular show right now is Stranger Things. That would be an example of magical realism. Stranger Things takes place, not in present day, but it takes place in the real world. And then these kind of fantastical elements are introduced into the plot, but they're woven into this realistic setting. Characters in magical realism are usually normal human beings without any supernatural powers, and magical elements don't necessarily dominate or drive the plot. In fact, the magical part of magical realism can sometimes be misleading. with my earlier example from Daughter of Fortune, the magical realism element that comes into play is a ghost. So it's not necessarily magic in the way we might traditionally think of magic. Magical realism could mean like a dream world or a world that seems different from the normal everyday world. In the story that we're going to read, The Night Face Up, you'll kind of have to decide which you think is the fantasy world and which is the real world. Because both worlds do have realistic elements to them, and it's just a matter of kind of perspective. So that has been our review of magical realism. And as you read your story this week, The Night Face Up, I want you to think about how magical realism comes into play in that story.